Welcome. Today we're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the document adopted by the United Nations in December of 1948. We're going to talk about some of the ideas and some of the steps that led up to the drafting of the document. We'll talk about the actual drafting process, some of the people and some of the delegates of various nations involved. And then we'll talk about the response to the document in the years and in the decades following, and we'll also give an analysis from an objectivist perspective. Here to help me disentangle some of the legal and international implications is my friend James Valliant. James, how are you doing today?
I'm quite well. Hope you are too, Nicholas.
I am. And I think a good place to start in talking about the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights is to begin with Franklin D. Roosevelt and his Four Freedoms speech, which he gave. It was an address he gave to the nation in December of 1941. Now, this was 11 months before Pearl Harbor, before the United States actually entered the war. But the purpose of this address, the purpose behind FDR's Four Freedoms was to lay out the basic principles of human rights that all nations, that all human beings should agree to. And the list of four freedoms is very interesting. So it begins with freedom of speech. We can all agree with that. Freedom of worship, okay, or freedom of religion, yeah, that's fine. Freedom from fear, okay, that's a little bit hard to understand. And then freedom from want. Okay, well, now we're already in very problematic territory. The reason we're starting here was because the four freedoms, FDR's Four Freedoms, were actually incorporated into the preamble of the eventual document that was adopted 7 years later. So, James, just to lay the foundation here, can we talk a little bit about Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Four Freedoms, and how this framework eventually led to the document itself, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself?
Well, we were discussing in a recent podcast the development of, for example, the International Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions. And there had been long, obviously, before the 1940s and the advent of the United Nations, an international concerted effort to protect prisoners of war, prisoners of conscience, get people the healthcare they might need out on the battlefield. And so there were international organizations attempting to create an international protocol among nations that would respect a certain set of minimal rights. And they weren't as corrupt in terms of asserting rights as this came out to be. But of course, the United States, in an effort to turn the world into a more moral and just place. It began with, frankly, Woodrow Wilson in World War I. These progressive types wanted to, make the world safe for democracy. They had these grander ambitions. And Woodrow Wilson, one of his grander ambitions was the League of Nations, which the United States did not join, but which was basically his idea. And the first real international organization, a proto-United Nations. Of course, it was a disastrous failure. It prevented the rise. It did not prevent the rise, most notoriously did not prevent the rise of totalitarianism all over the world, or World War II from breaking out. And you can tell
I can't resist inserting one fun fact. The idea for a League of Nations apparently originally came from Immanuel Kant, from one of his political, which Woodrow Wilson was interested in Kant's writings, and that's where he got that idea.
He was an intellectual. He was the president of Princeton University before he became the governor of New Jersey and president of the United States. He was an intellectual. He was a progressive. He was the first great progressive Democrat president in the United States. But the League of Nations, idealistic as it was, in its sense, now get that, idealistic in its sense, it was an utter failure in preventing world war or totalitarianism. And you can see already in FDR's head, the idea of this already, as you pointed out, this was before U.S. entry into World War II. He's talking about the basic freedoms that all the world should recognize, including these ridiculous, anti-concept applications of rights that you just went through. Well, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was, again, one of these, quote, and I'm going to put it in quote, idealists who believed that when the war ended, especially in the wake of the Holocaust and the horrors that were learned about Nazi Germany, that we should try again with one of these international organizations, the United Nations, and that they should, and one of the very first things the United Nations did was to adopt, no one voted against it, of the original member nations. The vast majority voted for it, some abstained, but to get this internationally recognized statement of rights, which is of course an abomination, an utter abomination when it comes to rights. It's the destruction of the concept of rights. It's a joke in the first place because there's no government to enforce it. There's no philosophical basis given for rights. What are rights? Why do people need them? What is the actual objective basis for rights? With a poor understanding of rights, with no real definition of rights, they incorporate these vague and talk about vague pseudo concepts that come from people like FDR and his Four Freedom speech into, as you say, built into the preamble. Freedom from fear, freedom from want are actually terms that are used in this Declaration of Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, got in passed in the 1940s from one of the very first sessions of the United Nations. Now, I would ask you to consider the history of the world since it was adopted by the United Nations. Did it prevent Soviet tyranny? Did it prevent gulags and psychiatric hospitals and forced labor in the Soviet Union decade after decade? Did it prevent Idi Amin in Uganda or Pol Pot in Cambodia? Did it prevent North Korea from still being what North Korea is today? Did it prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from coming into being and to start hanging sex criminals, like homosexuals or women who show an inch of skin, they get put in prison and mysteriously die? So it has done zero to help the actual cause of real human rights. And it has done so not merely because it doesn't have the correct philosophical foundation, but because it is actually an assault on rights. By having those by combining an idea that you might, like you say, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the idea we have freedom of conscience. And there is this idea. See, the concept of rights was stolen by the progressives in the 20th century. The concept of individual rights was created by liberals like John Locke and enforced for the first time in reality in the English and American legal systems, a little even before John Locke. We've got the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the English Bill of Rights that followed that. You've got the American Revolution and the American Constitution and Bill of Rights that followed that. And you've got classical liberals defending that kind of individual rights. Part of this conception, if I could just make a side note, is that the only alternative to slavery in some form are individual property rights. So was the argument of John Locke. Okay, without that understanding, without that fundamental understanding of what a right is, far better in the Locke and American founding fathers' conception of it. But you see, it's a moral concept. It's like I keep using this word idealistic. Because it was a source of moral idealism, it had to be stolen and corrupted by the progressives. And I mean progressives who were both from the Republican and Democratic parties in my own country, by the way. They stole the concept of rights, corrupted it altogether, applied it to places where it didn't belong, said people had a right to material sustenance. Freedom from fear, what's that? How can that possibly be? Freedom from an emotion? A natural emotion that I'm going to feel. Look, if I walk out and it's a rainy day and I'm not dressed properly, I'm going to feel a degree of fear. Can they honestly prevent people from experiencing fear in reality? That's an assault on the very concept of rights, because what it does is it detaches rights from any kind of realistic application, from any objective meaning. There's no way you can make an objective definition or come to some kind of factual understanding of what rights are if you have something so absurd as freedom from fear built into your very concept. Freedom from want? I don't know any multimillionaires who are free from want. It is absolutely a bizarre, absurd. And when you attack rights like that, what you've done is you've done worse than giving us there is nothing worse than a bad defense of a good idea. And the defenses of individual rights were not sound. It is true, we needed Ayn Rand. John Stuart Mill was not there. It was not the hero of defense of individual rights. We needed Rand desperately to give us this moral foundation. But it's not merely the absence of the moral foundation. It's what they call rights, which undermines and destroys all other rights. For if we have a right to freedom from fear, freedom from want, then surely that implies some form of enslavement. Somebody has got to work, somebody's got to do something, somebody's got to provide you this absence of fear, this absence of want. And so there's a sort of, I know the distinction between slavery, say, and the welfare state, but there is a kind of involuntary servitude that is implied by those rights, even as they talk out of both sides of the mouth, even in another section of this Declaration of Rights, they say there can be no slavery or involuntary servitude. It is
what do you call income tax, right?
Yeah. Oh, if I can just give you some sense of the nonsensical rights that are enshrined in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 23 reads, number 1, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. You've got a right to be protected from unemployment and minimal work conditions. What are those minimal work conditions? Might they differ from country to country depending on what they can actually afford and what the context is? And who's going to support that? Who's going to pay for that? Again, number 2, everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. Well, there's no such thing as equal work. Everyone does it different. Anyone who's ever had a job knows that two people with the same job description, they're not doing equal work. The idea is inherently non-objective, but equal work for equal pay. Everyone who works has a right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Now, what the hell does that mean? And who's going to pay for that? And again, this vague nonsense about rights destroys the meaning of rights themselves. So the real right that you have, Nicholas, not to be tortured, not to be enslaved, not to be imprisoned by your government without due process, those are not to be murdered by someone else. Those rights, you see, are on the same plane as these vague rights to be free from want, to have a minimum income, to have favorable work conditions.
Also, one of the articles is the right to education. There's the right to health care. Those are all included. Now, just for those among our viewers who are not familiar with the background to why the Declaration took the particular form it did, let's just very briefly fill in some of the context. So the United Nations was chartered towards the end of the war, towards the end of 1945. And then in 1947, this committee was set up to draft a Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, as you pointed out, was made the chairperson of this committee, already a very huge red flag. So the principal drafter, or the principal early drafter of the Declaration, was a Canadian jurist named John Peters Humphrey. He did a lot of the earlier work. Then later on, a Frenchman, René Cassin, was brought in. He basically brought the document into its final form. But there was also input from delegates from several other nations, including China, Chile, Lebanon, I believe the Soviet Union, and several other countries. Now, it's interesting during this 2-year process, 1947, 1948, there were a lot of debates and disagreements behind the scenes. So, for example, the idea that the Declaration should enshrine so-called social, economic, and cultural rights, that actually came from the Chilean delegate. They specifically wanted, like you mentioned, the right to work, the right to a certain basic income, the right to health care, etc. And then, the declaration, I'm surprised that they were actually able to agree when you consider the diversity of opinion, of conflicting opinions, of conflicting philosophical frameworks among the individuals who were involved in drafting and giving feedback on the declaration.
Yeah, well, you can see how far the West had dropped in its understanding of rights. If the United States and Great Britain are all on board with this idea that's perfectly acceptable to the socialist countries of the world, there should have been some red flag going off. But then again, Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR were friendly to the idea of government protections. They gave America the New Deal.
New
And
Deal, exactly.
the Social Security system, for example, the retirement insurance, and that was the beginning, really the beginning of the American welfare state. They were very much in favor of a kind. It's no accident that now people are going to maybe get a little offended by what I'm about to say. It's no accident that Hitler and Stalin and FDR are all contemporaries. It is no accident that Mao took over China in the late 40s. It is no accident that Great Britain went fully socialist in the 1950s, at least economically. No accident at all. In the middle of the 20th century, the concept of rights as individual sanction for freedom had been completely destroyed and replaced with this vague, undefined notion. They stole, and just like they stole the word liberal from us, so they stole the concept of rights from us because it's a moral concept. It appealed to idealists. So you have a right not to be hungry, you see. You have a right to an education, don't you see? You have a right to participate in culture, don't you see? All of these positive rights, which have to come at someone else's expense, they were happy to go along with. The concept of the Soviet Union was no problem for FDR, for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. It was FDR who normalized relations with the Soviet Union when previous presidents after the Bolshevik Revolution would not recognize them. No. They were the great ideal. They were our allies. Members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives were praising Joe Stalin through most of the 40s, until they began to get everyone's attention by stealing the nuclear bomb and so forth, and dropping Churchill's Iron Curtain across Europe. It was only then that America started to get attention and not think Uncle Joe is this great guy. Literally, these people thought that these socialist rights, this positive right to earn a living, to have a decent living, to have decent housing, they thought those were actually rights. They did not understand the concept of rights, and in the process destroyed any actual meaning for rights. That's the only way I can put it.
Yeah. Now you pointed out that most of the member states of the United Nations at the time voted in favor of the declaration. Now, today the United Nations has something like 192 member states. At that time, they only had 58. Now, of those 58, 48 voted in favor of adopting the declaration. It was in December of 1948. And then there were 10 states that either abstained or didn't participate in the vote for whatever reason, but huge majority actually supported it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Now, it's interesting if we look at, in a moment, I want to look at some of the criticisms, some of the international criticisms of the declaration. But before we get that, can you just very briefly tell us what kind of legal force does this document have? How binding is it on the various member nations?
Well, that's easy. Zero. None. There is no government to enforce it. See, if you say to yourself, someone has rights, there has to be, to go with it. For it to be meaningful, there has to be an enforcement mechanism. If rights are a moral concept, then who are the guardians of those rights? If force is what we need protection against, where is this monopoly force agency that's going to protect us, protect our rights? No such thing.
That's why we need a one world government, right? A single for a single neck.
And you can really see from this corruption of rights and the inclusion of horrible dictatorships like Stalin, right from the start. Stalin's Soviet Union was included. Now, think that's obviously an organization that doesn't have the first clue what rights are. Any joining in with them about the enforcement of rights is going to be a destruction of rights, is going to be against our concept in the West, our liberal concept of rights, necessarily. What can you say? Ayn Rand, in her essay on man's rights, reproduced in Capitalism and an Ideal and in The Virtue of Selfishness, she had a really great point. She was just like Gresham's law in economics, where bad money drives out good, so a bad concept of rights drives out any valid concept of rights. I would really urge people to read that article Ayn Rand wrote on man's rights. It's a brilliant one, and she nails this very point right here. It is meaningless. It is meaningless when you include those kind of rights. In fact, what it's designed to do is destroy the actual concept of rights. Because if rights are to material goods that someone else has to provide for me, there's no objective measure of these rights. There's an insatiable maw that will always demand more and more and more and more and more. We're never ever, it's never an awareness of context. It's never an awareness that someone's work had to provide that material sustenance that someone else claims a right to. It's no different, in effect, theoretically, than theft, or even in one sense, slavery. I am very aware of the difference between theft and taxes, say, or between slavery and chattel slavery. And but if you look at some of these nations, like the Soviet Union, there is no distinction. In my view, they're all slaves. If you look at the people of Venezuela today, they're slaves. They're slaves. They're slaves to their government, or they have to be working outside the system altogether, leave the grid entirely, or leave the country entirely to operate. So when you're sanctioning slavery, when you're sanctioning the greatest violators of individual rights in human history, and you're getting them on board with this proposal to support human rights, you're in fact becoming an agent of rights destruction. An agent of rights destruction. Any cooperation with the United Nations, any cooperation with a rights statement that includes, say, the Soviet Union, is necessarily going to be violative of rights. It's going to look at it, like I say, consider the decades after 1948 in the Soviet Union, from 1958, 68, 78, 88. That's 40 plus years of slavery. If anyone thinks that, for example, we were signatories, we the Russians, we're enforcing these rights, we're protectors of these rights. To put up with that sham by itself is a joke. But there is no enforcement mechanism. There is no way you can say to Soviet.
Yeah, that's really the essence of Ayn Rand's condemnation of the United Nations, that it provides the moral sanctions for states that conduct various acts of tyranny and enslavement. Now for the punchline, let's talk about some of the international criticisms of the Universal Declaration. So I know there were a lot of concerns from South Africa that they saw the Universal Declaration as a threat to apartheid. They didn't want to adopt or accept the document because they thought it would throw a monkey wrench in their apartheid machine. So that's one thing. There was a lot of criticism among Islamic nations. Freedom of religion. Well, they didn't like that because that's contrary to Sharia law. Equality of women. They didn't like that because that's a threat to Sharia law, that contradicts Sharia law. There were a lot of Asian countries, a lot of East Asian countries who thought that the declaration was too Western, it was too individualistic, that we need to recognize the fact that the individual finds his identity through the collective, through the culture. So we need something that's more collectivistic. So there have been attempts to
cultures have rights. Don't you know, Nicholas? Cultures have rights. And so the idea, especially to meet the objection, the last two sets of objections you met, there was sort of a response that said, no. Of course, you have your right to your culture, and if that culture means hanging homosexuals and arresting women for not wearing their burqa, well, then that's your culture. That's your culture. So cultures have rights, and you have a right to, enforce a theocracy if you want, because that's your culture, your collective right. And so again, you see, when you've replaced when you collectivize these rights, you've destroyed the right. You've absolutely destroyed the right. It is against, as Ayn Rand points out, it is against the group that we need rights. It's individuals who are the choosing agents. It's individuals alone who can have rights. Once you go down that path of collectivized rights, which these criticisms actually caused ideologues to go down exactly that path, to say that, for example, Muslim nations, gosh, after all, don't they have a right to their culture? There's a tension here, granted, because the initial statement of rights said that there has to be sexual and racial equality. So, for example, South Africa said, we want to be racist. Well, the Universal Declaration of Rights says no, racial equality. You can't discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, sex. And so if you're building that in, obviously racist, apartheid, authoritarian nations like South Africa are going to object. And you notice that it wasn't this Declaration of Rights that had any impact in bringing down the apartheid government at all. None, zero, zip, zilch. This sort of stuff from the UN and this Declaration of Rights has had, not only has it not done anything to protect the world against horrific dictatorships, which still exist in this world today, but it has undermined the very concept of rights, so that our ability to morally criticize the Soviet Union, North Korea, Iran, wherever else tyranny exists, is necessarily undermined. And of course, whatever feeble, that you asked about enforcement mechanism, well, the UN adopted this. And they say, well, they're enshrining this, and they urge all nations to educate. There's even a part of it that says, we urge all nations to spread these ideas, educate their people on individual rights. Now, again,
there's even an international human, I think it's December 10th is International Human Rights Day, where we're supposed to celebrate this this document, which in fact, as you pointed out, really amounts to a perversion of human rights. Now,
exactly.
I see we only have a couple of minutes left, so let's just briefly check in with our producer, Daniel. Do we have any comments or super chats from our viewers?
We have a super chat from Jeff. Thank you so much. Also a super chat from Wes. Thank you so much also. And the super chat from Christopher. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much for your support. So let's wrap up. Now, I should mention that I think it was sometime in the late 60s that one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was granted, I think it might have been the Frenchman, René Cassin, was granted the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in this document. And that's what James and I are going to talk about probably next week. We're going to have a little discussion of the Nobel Prizes and specifically the Nobel Peace Prize, whether it's something legitimate or whether it's BS. Take a guess. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much, James, for your insights and contributions on this topic. Thank you to our viewers and subscribers for your support. Daniel, any final announcements before we wrap up today?
In a couple of minutes at 6 p.m. UK time, we have the reality show on Should Britain Rejoin the EU? A link for that is in the chat. And then at 10 p.m. UK time, we have Life on Earth with Robert and Amy Nasser on the top 5 ways you're not selfish enough.
Ooh, sounds intriguing. Okay.
Yeah, well, and they're asking for audience
as always. And
yeah, well, thank you. Always great.
Yeah, I look forward to our hopefully next week our upcoming discussion on the Nobel Peace Prize, and we also have to do that episode on the death penalty as well. We can maybe do that the following week. So lots of excellent stuff coming up on this channel, the ARC UK YouTube channel. So I look forward to seeing James. Look forward to seeing all of you in the very near future. Until then, I wish you all the best of premises.
Take care.
And also super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much.